Town Hall today on science leadership with Dr. Shawn Bediako. I'm really pleased to welcome Shawn to our space here with UERU. Shawn is a science leadership advocate and former professor of psychology at UMBC and the University of Cincinnati. An interdisciplinary social and behavioral scientist, Dr. Bediako is committed to facilitating transformative innovations in scientific education and mentoring. His academic research has focused on sickle cell disease, social identity, stigma, and other issues relevant to community health. Dr. Bediako received his BS in psychology from the University of Central Arkansas, MS in community psychology from FAMU, and PhD in social and health psychology from Stony Brook University. Welcome, Shawn. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Julia, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me get things set up here. All right. I think you all should be able to see the screen, correct?
Yep, looks good.
All right, great. Julia, again, I just want to thank you for the introduction, and I want to start by saying just how grateful I am to the UERU team for inviting me to participate in this town hall. It would be an understatement for me to say that I've been looking forward to this opportunity for quite some time. And I'm really showing up today with a great deal of enthusiasm because we get to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is leadership. And that's a topic that I believe is central to both the future of scientific progress, but also a topic that I think is central to the future of higher education in general. And before I jump into this, though, I want to briefly set the context for why I am an ardent advocate for leadership and leadership development. As Julia mentioned, move forward. Yes, as Julia mentioned, I'm from Arkansas, and I grew up in Southern Arkansas, but my maternal grandparents were sharecroppers in the Arkansas Delta region, where they grew cotton and soybeans. It was hard, unglamorous work that I think all of us can identify with as academics. But what I saw in my grandparents' efforts while I was growing up wasn't just their performance of backbreaking labor. What I witnessed was the ways that they engaged in cultivation. They weren't just growing crops, they also grew a family, they developed relationships with others, and they cultivated opportunities for others from those relationships. So this is where my understanding of leadership begins, not with titles, not with organizational charts, not with job descriptions or performance reviews, but rather with a strong commitment to make something, especially other people, grow. Now, in science and in many parts of society, we often focus on and reward the outcomes, the breakthroughs, the individual achievements. But I believe that real leadership is like planting seeds. It's definitely hard work. It's often unglamorous. There's a lot in it that is unseen and often taken for granted. But when leadership gets optimized, you recognize its value by the opportunities for growth that it provides for others. And that's the kind of leadership that I believe we need to reimagine. And that's what I want to explore with you today. So that ethic of cultivation, of investing in others when it's not directly observed or directly rewarded, that has shaped every stage of my professional path. I've seen this ethic in action among my colleagues when I was a professor, a lab leader, and an administrator in the academy. I also have seen it in the federal research sector during my time at the NHLBI, where I was able to lead and work with others in the Division of Intramural Research. There we created programs that shaped the scientific training experiences and professional development of post-bac, graduate, and postdoctoral fellows. And I've also seen this while working with a remarkable team of colleagues in the science philanthropic space, where I help to lead programs that support universities like yours that are refining the ways that we educate and train new generations of scientists. So all of these experiences have helped me think about the practice of leadership development in in broad and comprehensive ways. Now, one of the key lessons that I've learned, and that's where I want to kind of start today, is that leadership is often defined as the action of leading a group of people or an organization. And in my view, there are at least two implicit characteristics in our understanding of, or at least our typical understanding of science leadership. Number one is that we kind of see this in linear terms, where a leader is the person who's responsible for guiding a team from point A to point B. And second, leadership often is presented as something that's earned or given after one has reached a certain status. That is, after you've produced, published, or accomplished enough of what the scientific establishment values. So, in this sense, leadership is something that only occurs after you've met certain prerequisites. And in this model, leadership is assumed to be something that's directive and authoritative. My question is, what if we looked at leadership differently? What if instead of seeing leadership as something that only accomplished individuals can do, we viewed it as an intentional process of developing cultivators? And I argue that this subtle shift might assist with both the internal growth that's necessary for good leadership and the external growth that's critical for the optimal practice of leadership. And this question that I've been sitting with for the past 6 years is really this: how can we reimagine leadership so that it's not merely a reward for achievement, but rather a shared responsibility that operates across the entire educational experience? So again, how can we reimagine leadership so that it's not merely a reward for achievement, but rather a shared responsibility across the entire educational experience? My approach to trying to answer this question, and I will pause by saying I don't know that I have all the answers, but my approach to answering this question is based on what I've taken from my experiences in these three domains: in the academy, in the federal setting, and in the philanthropic sector. Now, in the academy, I learned to lead from wherever I sat. And oftentimes that was from what I would call those middle spaces, the roles that didn't necessarily have a status, position, or title associated with them, but where I focused a lot on advocacy and mentorship that was done in the service of supporting students and learning how to navigate hierarchies. That's what I took from my experiences in the academy. At NIH, my leadership experience was about understanding rules and parameters and being able to effectively use resources that enable me to do programming for fellows and investigators. In the philanthropic space, I've come to understand the importance of systems level leadership and how to think strategically about culture and culture change across an institution, and how to communicate one's approach to transformative action. Now, one of the things that's been common across all of those contexts was the internal work that I had to do with myself that led in many ways to my own growth and maturity as a leader. I had to understand my identity, and I had to understand how to make choices about how my identity would show up in my leadership. I had to learn humility. I had to learn patience and learn how to engage in reflective practice. So I had to learn how to be as effective a communicator as I was as effective a leader. a listener. I'm sorry. So those things kind of were operating as I was learning these things about the context that I was in. I was also spending a significant amount of time learning things about myself that would enable me to approach those things or even to be able to observe those things in an optimal manner. And I learned that there are significant cultural and structural barriers that complicate our leadership journeys and that make it feel risky or burdensome sometimes. Some of those barriers, first is this notion of disciplinary silos that keep us in um, lanes. There are what I consider to be arbitrary distinctions between the so-called hard sciences and soft sciences that do very little, in my view, to help us understand that there's a unity of inquiry that binds all scientists together and the complementarity that one set of science skills has with those of another. Second, academic science culture itself has not really figured out how to reward collective growth over individual achievement. Some scientists are not deemed to have arrived, so to speak, until they win a prize or are lauded for certain types of accomplishments that they make. And I think that this emphasis on individual achievement allows us to conflate performance outcomes with readiness for leadership. And finally, and perhaps this might be the most controversial thing I say today, is this idea that there is a dearth of development opportunities for science leaders. Um, in my view, again, I think that most scientists are trained to manage and not lead. And when they find themselves in a leadership role, there is a tendency to use management skills in situations that call for leadership. And I want to pause for a second and just say that I want to be very, very clear in stating that it's not my intent to say that management is not important or that leadership is better than management. It's certainly management is certainly it certainly is important. But I will say that if you were to ask me to go fishing with you, I'm going to bring a very different tackle box if we're fishing for bass compared to what I'd bring if we were fishing for sharks. So even though the act of fishing is kind of the same across situations and contexts, sometimes the context really does matter. And that's what the point I'm trying to make with the distinction with management skills versus leadership skills, that sometimes, even though there is some overlap between the two, depending on the context, one may be needed more than the other. So what are some of the things that we could do in response to these barriers? And I think this is where reimagining leadership becomes important. One of the things that I think might aid in reimagining leadership is to conduct an audit of our leadership ecosystem. Every university has a leadership ecosystem. Some are much more visible than others. So some of the questions that we ask is like, who gets invited to serve on key committees and why? Who's being groomed for department or center leadership? Why? Who gets access to leadership development opportunities and why? So doing a leadership audit can help to identify some of the gaps and point to ways that we can be more intentional about cultivating leadership more broadly at all levels. Second, we can rethink how we go about investing in leadership development. So the question is, are we reifying the hierarchical model of leadership? Are we unnecessarily compartmentalizing leadership training as something that should only occur within groups? So usually within groups of students, within groups of staff, within groups of faculty. What would be the benefits of having students or staff actually mentor or coach faculty on how to be more empathic or adaptive in their leadership practice. What are the tools that people need to cultivate the spaces that they occupy? And how do we equip them with those tools? Oftentimes, students and staff are left out of those leadership conversations. So a key question is, how can we include them better? And finally, we don't have to do this work alone. So there's philanthropy, government agencies, nonprofits. All of these are spaces are of potential partners who want to help build leadership infrastructure. So the question here is, are we maximizing our use of the expertise that's out there? Or do we operate as if leadership in the academy is so unique that our only option is to work with other academicians or other people like us? So here, I think it's important for us to think about how our institutions can align their values with external support to scale leadership development. These partnerships can bring visibility, credibility, and sustainability to many of your leadership and leadership development efforts. So in terms of a few practical suggestions that I want to offer just as some starting points for our conversation about reimagining leadership, one of the first is a need for us to reframe science education outcomes. And this involves us, I guess, being encouraged to expand our definition of student success, to include leadership skill building in tandem with research excellence, not as something that's separate from or peripheral to research excellence. A second is to embed leadership competencies in our curricular offerings. So again, I guess related with the first point, looking at ways that we can integrate leadership development into our curricular offerings is one way that we can sort of embed these competencies in our curriculum. A third practical suggestion is to root STEM leadership in an adaptive framework. And here, this requires us being able to look at STEM leadership through various lenses. As I mentioned earlier, leadership through self-awareness, leadership through interpersonal influence and interpersonal communication, looking at leadership from a systems perspective and finding ways to enhance and facilitate our fluency in understanding how systems work. A fourth aspect is to broaden perspectives about how to lead, which may require us to think about ways that we can train faculty, staff, and students, particularly faculty and staff, though, to be equity-minded sponsors and gate openers and not just gatekeepers. And then finally, challenging the assumptions and the structures that perpetuate the silos that I discussed a little bit earlier. So here, this is a need for us to push for policies that actually reward collaborative and interdisciplinary work, pushing for policies that encourage co-creative initiatives that are mutually beneficial to campus and to campuses and to campus partners or to community neighbors. So what does it mean to reimagine STEM leadership? In my view, I think that means that we stop chasing perfection and we start nurturing potential. I think that it means that we lead not by pulling others up behind us, but by planting roots so that others can rise beside us. I think it means that we invest in people, not for our gain, but because their growth is part of our legacy. And sometimes we may not always see the full harvest of this cultivation, but if we commit to it, to the steady, generous work of developing others, I believe that we change the future, not just for STEM, not just for our institutions, but for every community that depends on what it is that we are trying to build. So I am offering an invitation for folks to start adopting the mindset of growers and lead like cultivators. And let's reimagine leadership as something that we plant together so that all of us can thrive. I believe that if we don't invest in leadership development and if we don't find new ways to invest in leadership development at every level in our ecosystem, one thing we can be certain of is having generations of leaders who are underprepared and overwhelmed. And for me, I believe that the stakes are too high for us to leave leadership to chance. And with that, I'm going to stop and kind of throw a few questions out here for folks to answer about what are some ways that, from where you sit right now, what are some ways that you can reimagine leadership, and who are some of the allies that you feel need to be at the table in order to facilitate that reimagining? I see Maria.
Yeah, I have a question, Shawn, because what you said really resonates with me on a number of levels, but I will start with this one, with your suggestion, maybe provocation, to embed student leadership in curricular offerings, which we have done at the University of Miami. So we offer students who are peer mentors and section leaders in discussion sessions for like the biology and chemistry courses. We offer them a curricular opportunity. They can also do it as an extracurricular, you know, on their free time. But this often becomes one of those boxes the pre-med students check. Because we tell them, you know, you need to do this many things in order to be more admissible to medical school. And it really doesn't translate into this is preparation for leadership, because when, you know, whether you go to medical school or a PhD, you will be working with people, you will be leading through example and through ideas. So how, I guess my question to myself and for all of us to consider is, how do we move students away from the box checking mentality to the, you know, I'm in it, I'm doing it because it's good for me and my community, regardless of what communities we're talking about?
No, I think that's an excellent question. I wish I had a succinct, clear-cut answer to that. In my view, I think, you know, one of the things when we think about curricular offerings, we think about requirements for matriculation through a program. The entire process becomes one of checking boxes, right? And I think one of the things that might be useful is to figure out ways to make this more of an applied experience and not just something that, you know, students complete or not, you know what I mean? And so interestingly enough, for the past year, I have been teaching psychological science in a prison. And the students that I have, you know, obviously they're all individuals who are incarcerated, but we did something a little bit different this year in terms of how I framed being evaluated, right? So they have a course evaluation that they can fill out with, you know, because these are all students who are enrolled in the university program, even though they're incarcerated, but they're in a degree granting university program. The university provides the evaluation for them, but I framed it as a leadership opportunity because what I told them was that the cohort that comes behind you needs to be able to benefit from the feedback that you give me. So even though your experience in the course was only for this semester, there's going to be another group coming behind you who will also experience this course. And so the way I framed it, I intentionally used the word leadership, but I connected it to their identities in this program. And the type of feedback that I got was so much more richer than what I could have gotten from just reading the course evaluations that the university gave them. And so I look at that as a form of leadership. And when we talk about adding this to the curricular offerings, I think one of the things that we may need to just kind of think in a more creative way about is how can we do this in a way so that it doesn't seem or feel so transactional? Because I think when we look at curricula, we look at graduation requirements and those things, students say, if I do this, I graduate. I think that's an issue of how we frame the action or the activities that we want them to do. So I don't know that I'm answering that in a succinct way, right? But I do think that a lot of it has to deal with the purpose and the intention behind what it is we're asking students to do. And there's also an element of it that is contingent upon how we frame the importance of what we're asking people to do. And I think the solution to what you're describing lies somewhere in that range.
Well, and the frame that you're suggesting, I hear you say, start with a why, which is always very powerful. So
Right.
thank you, Shawn. That was great.
All right. Thank you. All right. Pranesh?
Yeah, thank you, Shawn. A lot of the things you talked about really resonated with me as well, particularly your distinction between management and leadership. I think we don't think of that often. We think management is leadership, and it really is not. Two comments I wanted to make. One is being in a university, one of the things we should be doing more of is being more engaged with student groups, particularly the student professional groups, the groups that are engaged with their disciplines. You know, if it's ASME or it could be a SHIP or it could be NSBE or whatever it is, these are leadership development opportunities for our students. And having our advisors who are typically faculty being more engaged with that is hugely impactful to reach students where they are. You don't always have the opportunity for them to step up in a classroom, but they may be more willing to do so within the confines of their peers. And that is equally important, that they're building social skills and leadership skills at the same time. And I think that is hugely valuable skill set that can do. The second area is in science education, where we are actually training the teachers of tomorrow in our education programs. We rarely incorporate leadership as part of it. We teach them pedagogy, we teach them effective delivery of content, but we do not teach our students are going to be our future teachers about how to impact leadership at K-12, because that starts early on. You know, you need to get students engaged in leadership opportunities in the K-12 space, and that will carry over to college and beyond. So I think that is an area which has not been looked at as closely.
Right. I could not agree with you more. The utility of having students involved and engaged in organizations, clubs, those are all, like, for me, low-hanging fruit for leadership development. I would also think about ways to encourage cross constituencies interactions with those. So for example, I think to the extent that faculty advisors are part of the clubs, or that they have a visible presence in it. And again, not even thinking about this in terms of hierarchies, but also having opportunities for students who are in these types of clubs to advise or mentor or engage and interact with faculty around pedagogic ideas, around policies and procedures for things, right? I think those things could be very helpful because they aid in the one skill that I think is crucial for leadership that we often don't talk about, and that's communication. How do we talk across these so-called differences or across these dimensions of the academic ecosystem? The second thing I would say is, to your second point about the training of teachers, I have to give a shameless plug to a program that is taking place at UMBC, where I spent the majority of my academic career, and I wasn't directly involved with the program, but it's the Sherman STEM Educators Program. And that is specifically what they do, is they focus on science majors who want to be teachers. And there's a specific training, specific curricula that they do that emphasize, and it's not really framed as leadership, but a lot of what they do is really the building of leadership skills. And I think that some of the students who have come out of that program, who have gone into the K-12 space, are doing some really, really remarkable work in that regard. So I could not agree with you more on that.
Thank you.
So I see Jeff and Michael.
Thanks, Shawn. I'm almost just thinking out loud, and if you haven't read it, I would suggest you read Hillary's comments in the chat. I think in some ways I'm just reframing what she's saying and what our previous commenter was also saying. Shawn, I think I loved your sort of personal story about your own sort of reflective approach to leadership development. I think something I've come to way too late in the game. It also struck me that sort of active reflection and often writing is often, like, we think of that as what separates service learning from volunteerism, right? And what maybe we think of as separating sort of academic leadership training from sort of leadership experience might also be that sort of active reflection, which is something that has to, oftentimes it's faculty and instructors that can teach that skill. And this becomes like a really, I think, right place to partner with our student affairs colleagues, because I think so much of what they do is kind of the leadership equivalent of internship experiences. And if we could think about how to have that internship experience, but what makes an internship not just work is that reflective piece that I think is what the specialty, the special sauce that the faculty bring to that conversation. So thank you for just helping me think that through, and appreciate your contributions.
No, I appreciate those comments. I will respectfully push back a little bit on the part about it being late. And I don't think it's ever too late in the game. I think whenever you discover an opportunity to do what you do better is the perfect time for you to continue doing better. So that's the only thing, I'm joking about it, but
I appreciate the space. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that it took me I think I was about 12 or 13 years into my faculty appointment before I realized there were some things I needed to do a little bit differently. And I am all the better for that. I wish I had learned it sooner, but I guess it just I wasn't prepared to really understand and grasp the lessons that I was being taught until I was 10 or 12 years into my career. So yeah, I don't think it's ever too late. I think if today is that day, then hey, let's celebrate that. And that means that we got more opportunities tomorrow to do something different that can have a significant impact for other people. So that's all I want to say. Michael?
John, thanks a lot for the conversation today. Want to thank all the questions in the conversations in the chat, which are really profound. Maria, thank you for that earlier question, my good friend down in the good weather spot. You mentioned the issue of identity a little bit earlier on in the talk, and it just made me think about whatever the space, academic, corporate, whatever the space is, there are always folks who have traditionally been underrepresented in that space. Could be gender-based, could be ethnicity-based, could be a lot of reasons why those folks have been underrepresented in that space. But really thinking about how a person develops the ability to be a leader in that space is not only about an internal, but mostly I would say internal, but also about how folks reach out and find mentorship in that space as well, kind of connected to, or sometimes there's a barrier that rises up because they have been traditionally underrepresented in that space. And I think about the term imposter syndrome, and I think for folks who've been underrepresented in the space, it's a W.B. Du Bois double negative right there, right? So you're thinking about, should I be here? First of all, because people think because I'm here, I automatically have some leadership skills, or I think of myself in that way. But then you're also trying to battle through this identity issue about why you haven't traditionally been here in this space as well. So I wonder if you could talk. I had to bring up Du Bois. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what your journey looked like in that particular space as well, because I find that to be kind of a double blind barrier that some folks are trying to deal with in those spaces.
No, I think that's an excellent question. I don't know how much time we have for that. All right. That's one of those that I had to take the jacket off and unloosen the knot in the tie and talk about that. I think there's so much to unpack in that. What I can say is, as part of my own personal journey, and again, just to be quite candid with you and very honest and transparent, when I left the academy, I took a leave of absence from my faculty position. Ironically, not too long after I got promoted to full professor. And as soon as that, I made sure the ink was dry in my letter, and I made sure that everything was updated in the system, so that I'm like, okay, I'm listed as a full professor, everything's great. I'm like, I need to step away from this for a little bit. And part of that was I wanted to get a different type of experience, especially around the leadership component. And I had the opportunity to go to the federal sector. Now, when I went into that, to your point about imposter syndrome, once I started at NHLBI, after my first day, I was like, I am woefully unprepared for this position. This is an inadequate place for me to be. My thinking was, because I'm talking with all of these investigators in the intramural program who are world-class scientists, experts at what they do. A lot of them are basic scientists. And I realized they were talking about things that I could barely pronounce. I'm a psychologist by training, social health psychologist. Even though I'm a biomedical researcher, because my research focused on sickle cell disease, this was a whole different level. This was a whole different game for me. And I spent the first couple of weeks trying to figure out how I was just going to go back from my leave of absence, cut that short so I could just get back to the environment that I felt more comfortable in. I felt like I didn't have anything to offer. After I met with my first group of postdocs, there was a couple of investigators in particular that kept sending their fellows to me. You need to talk to Bediako. You should go talk to Bediako. And I'm wondering, like, why are they sending these people to me? And I realized what it was that I knew something that the investigators didn't know, because most of them had spent their entire careers in the intramural program doing this world-class research, but they never had to write a grant. And so they were like, this guy's coming from the academy where all they have to do, like, they don't do research if they don't get grants. So they were sending their fellows to me because I was supposed to be the repository of all this expertise about grant writing. And I'm sitting here thinking that I don't deserve a spot here because I don't belong here. And it wasn't until, again, to the point made about reflective practice, I had to sit back and think about, why am I thinking about this way? Why am I thinking about this in terms of deficits and limitations? And that's part of the science culture, right? It's one of the things that we don't give a lot of credence to, but rejection is part of being a scientist. And it gets ingrained in us in some ways. And so, that was one of the things that made me just kind of pause for a second and shift my thinking from what I don't do well to thinking about what do I bring to this that other people don't, that other people need, or that other people don't have. And by doing that, that allowed me to look at myself in a very different light. And I've always joked with some of my friends, I'm like, I think if I ever go back to the academy, I'm contaminated because I don't think in this like limited from a framework anymore. I think I'm primed now to think more about what's possible as opposed to why we can't do something. And I wouldn't have gotten that experience if I hadn't put myself in a situation or environment that I didn't think I belonged in. And so I don't know if that answers all of the question that you're asking. I think there's a lot more that we could unpack about that. But I will say that it was my time at NHLBI that allowed me to think of myself as a leader, because part of me leaving the academy was because I was feeling like I wasn't getting opportunities for leadership. But I realized that once I got there and I'm talking with the fellows and I'm looking at the space that I'm occupying and I'm helping the first crop of postdoctoral fellows be successful in getting K99 awards that they hadn't been getting before. And then I realized like, wait, no, I am a leader. What I was looking for when I was in academy was a position. I was looking for a title. I was looking for a status. And it allowed me to like, no, I've always occupied this type of space as a leader, but that's not how I was framing it when I was in the academy. So it took me putting myself in an uncomfortable or different type of environment for me to really have space to reflect on who I am and what I bring to the table. And so I wouldn't have gotten that if I didn't leave. And so part of that is somewhere in I think part of the response to the question that you're asking. I think there's a whole lot more to go about in terms of what you mean about, being underrepresented, because and seeking mentorship in those spaces. Because I guess my experience has been somewhat a little bit different, because I've always had good mentors, and I've always had people in my corner who support me, who have supported me in a holistic way. From my undergrad advisors to my graduate advisors, they haven't always agreed with every step that I've taken. So for example, again, to be quite candid and honest, one of my mentors, after like told me that taking a leave of absence was risky. And they were like, yeah, if you ever step away from the academy, you can be assured you will never get back in. And that scared, like, that scared me so bad. But then I was thought about like, wait a minute. So you mean to tell me that I was an assistant professor, I went through contract renewal, I got grants, I published, I had great teaching evaluations, I did all this service, I did all these things to where even external reviewers wrote these glowing letters for my promotion, not once, but twice. And you're saying that if I step away from this for a short period of time, that all of this is gone? And so I had to just kind of really, sit through that and think about it. But I was fortunate to have people who I could rely on, who I could pose these questions to. And these are folks from all backgrounds, all types of backgrounds. And the majority of them, majority of my mentors professionally have been women. And so learning again from the experiences, the difficulties, the challenges that they've had has also been something that has helped guide me in how I frame the way that I show up in places. And, being able to step away from it and have these broad ranges of experiences, those are things that have only broadened the way that I see myself in this space. And it's given me a lot more confidence and a lot more belief in the competencies that I bring that I might not have otherwise even been able to recognize.
Wow, I really appreciate the intentionality of the reframing, and Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, you covered it, my brother. You covered
Thank you. Thank
All
you.
right.
Chad?
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about this during the talk, and then I think that really great answer you just gave made me think some more about the annual merit process or the P&T process for faculty in the academy. Does that need to be revised to cultivate this kind of leadership that you're talking about, in the middle ranks? And I'm seeing so many head nods, so I'm going to follow that straight up with like, how, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think it does need to. I don't know that I would use the word change, only because I think that there's a lot of negative residue that people have with the term change. It definitely needs to be refined. It needs to be broadened. It needs to be expanded. It needs to be cleaned up. It needs to be different. The how, I don't know that I'm in the best position to answer that. Because I think part of the thing is that it will vary by institution. And that's one of the experiences that I've had. In fact, like just this morning, I got a email from an institution asking to be a reviewer for a faculty member who's going up for a promotion. And each one of those that I get, I feel obligated to participate in the process, because I feel like it's an opportunity to kind of share my perspective about what are some of the things that I think should be weighted in how you promote people, how you tenure people. So I get that opportunity as a reviewer. I don't know if that ends up helping the candidate at all, but at least that's like the space that I am able to offer those thoughts and those ideas. So I wish I could be more prescriptive about what I think are some of the specific changes that need to be made. But I do think that there's consensus, at least amongst this group right now, that yeah, stuff needs to change. And I don't know, maybe that might be something that UERU comes up with as some recommended best practices, particularly as it relates to research education. So I have to kind of sidestep that a little bit, but I do believe that that's something that would be a worthwhile endeavor for us to really sit down and seriously think through, either with or without the accreditation agencies at the table. Because I think they hold a lot of sway over what the parameters could be for how we make these changes.
Thanks.
Hey, if no one else has a question, could I ask one? Shawn, while we were doing this town hall, it was announced that the federal government's going to prevent Harvard University from accepting international students in their student body. This was like a quick announcement just a few minutes ago. And I imagine many of those international students are wanting to come to the US to be involved in STEM research in one way or another. I don't know all the data, but that's just my supposition there. So we were talking before we began the town hall about we live in interesting times, you said, and is there an element of leadership in this space that, or is your thinking about leadership, could it be applicable to the kind of crisis situation we find ourselves in with lots of emergencies sort of emerging almost on a daily basis, big fundamental challenges, this kind of time that we live in, could you say a little bit about that, how you're experiencing it, what you'd recommend?
Yeah, I can try to. I think, and I was having a conversation about this a couple of weeks ago with a colleague. I think one of the things, like where, in my view, where leadership is most needed is someone has to create some distance between the community we serve or communities we serve and the source of the issues or challenges. I think that what's going on right now is that we are in this perpetual state of reacting. And what leadership requires is that we have at least some small cadre of people who can be in a state of responding. And I think there are some very nuanced differences between reacting and responding. And that responding, I think, will require some folks to kind of have some distance from the problem to be able to understand, like, to see the lay of the land and to think a little bit differently about what's going on. Right now, there's so much unpredictability and uncertainty. Things are being destroyed. But one of the common denominators with all the things that's going on right now is that everything's being taken away. That's what it feels like, at least, right? So much is being removed, eliminated, canceled. And again, to play off of this cultivation metaphor, I think we need a cadre of people who understand that when things are taken away, that we can react by grieving the things that are taken away, but we can also respond by looking at this as an opportunity to replace it with something else. And so that's what I think. Like, how do we get there? I'm not like 100% sure on that, but I do think that the importance of imagination, and I borrowed that concept a lot from Ruha Benjamin's work. I think the title of the book is Imagination, a Manifesto. And also Adam Grant's Think Again. Like, so I think those two books kind of provide some guidelines for us to just make sure that we don't underestimate the importance of being creative and stepping away and looking at challenging times and challenging situations as opportunities to reframe, regrow, replace something that's taken away. And I think that's where leadership kind of steps in, that we need folks who can occupy that sort of space, that while we have one group of people kind of consoling those who are reacting to what's going on, we have another group who are thinking about, well, what is the appropriate response to this? And what does this provide an opportunity for us to do that we can replace this with in a different manner?
Thank you.
Shawn, I have one last question for you. I think all of us are sort of overwhelmed by everything that's happening, and as well as our daily work and the need to kind of keep up with everything happening on campus. What's one thing you could suggest for, particularly for this group of UVPs and others in similar positions, to take a forward step on creating these types of nurturing leadership experiences for the next generation, particularly in science, but not necessarily exclusively in science? What's one thing we could implement or consider implementing sort of right now without having to make really big changes to, say, the curriculum and so forth?
Great question. Wow. One thing, so I feel like the danger of convening people to talk is that you get into what folks will call gripe sessions, and everybody will want to, add to the tenor of the time, of the moments. But I believe that, and again, this comes from my own personal experiences, that it's so important to have community. And it's so important to have people who you rely on, and who you can talk to about things. To the extent that folks can be convened to just have space to acknowledge what's being lost, to acknowledge what is like hurtful right now, I think that can go a long way as a first step. But then a second part of that is to find ways to encourage people to think differently about, well, what is the intentionality behind why you're here, why you are in this space? I don't know that I can answer. I think, yeah, this is a tough one, only because I think we've really been underestimating the gravity of how people are feeling in the moment. And I think this is a watershed moment in many ways for the academy, because as you can tell by my response, we are often uncomfortable talking about our feelings and our emotions and the things that make us human beings. And so I guess where I'm trying to get at is anything that can help to humanize this experience that we're having, but also center it around the reason why we are in this space to begin with. I think is important to kind of connect back to that. You know, most of us, when we were young and folks asked us what we wanted to be when we grew up, I don't think anyone said, I wanted to be a vice president of student affairs, or I wanted to be a dean of natural sciences. I don't think I apologize to those of you who did say that when you were 6 years old, or, you know, 7. But I think most of us did not come into this in that way. We've had experiences that have kind of guided us to where we are in these spaces that we occupy. And I think sometimes it's worth just having a reflective moment to humanize that journey and to remember and recall why we chose this path to begin with. And that may allow us to kind of figure out what is that kernel or that element that we want to hold on to that can help sustain us through these turbulent and challenging times.
Well, it's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much, Shawn, for being here. I really found your talk very inspiring. I hope everyone else did as well. And join me in thanking Shawn for being here today. More events coming up on the UERU events page. Check it out. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Shawn. Thanks, everyone.